I was reading Sir Isaac Newton's uh, Chronology, and more particularly its summary or short chronicle, which sets the years before Christ, and with those years writes the significant events of world history corresponding to that particular date. And in the first part of my speech, I read up to 994 before Christ, and now I wish to start with that date and read out the remaining part of Sir Newton's short chronicle. In 1994 before Christ, Aegeus reigns in Attica. In 1993, Pelops, the son of Tantalus, comes into Peloponnesus, marries Hippodamia, the granddaughter of Acrisius, takes Aetolia from Aetolus, the son of Endymion, and by his riches grows potent. In 990 before Christ, Amphion and Zetus slay Licus, put Laius, the son of Labdacus, to flight, and reign in Thebes and wall the city about. In 989, Daedalus and his nephew Thallus invent the saw, the turning lathe, the wimble, the chip axe, and other instruments of carpenters and joiners, and thereby give a beginning to those arts in Europe. Daedalus also invented the making of statues with their feet asunder as if they walked. In 988, Minos makes war upon the Athenians for killing his son Androgeus. Aeacus flourishes. In 987, Daedalus kills his nephew Thallus and flies to Minos. A priestess of Jupiter Ammon, being brought by Phoenician merchants into Greece, sets up the oracle of Jupiter at Dodona. This gives a beginning to oracles in Greece, and by their dictates, the worship of the dead is everywhere introduced. In 983, Sisyphus, the son of Aeolus and grandson of Helen, reigns in Corinth, and some say that he built that city. In 980, Laius recovers the kingdom of Thebes. Atamas, the brother of Sisyphus and the father of Phrixus and Hele, marries Ino, the daughter of Cadmus. In 979 before Christ, Rehoboam reigns. Thoas is sent from Crete to Lemnos, reigns there in the city Hephaestia, and works in copper and iron. In 978 before Christ, Alcmena, born of Electrio, the son of Perseus and Andromeda, and of Lysidice, the daughter of Pelops. In 974 before Christ, Sesach spoils the temple and invades Syria and Persia, setting up pillars in many places. Jeroboam, becoming subject to Sesach, sets up the worship of the Egyptian gods in Israel. In 971 before Christ, Sesach invades India and returns with triumph the next year, but won. Whence Trieterica Bakki. He sets up pillars on two mountains at the mouth of the river Ganj. In 968, Theseus reigns, having overcome the Minotaur, and soon after unites the 12 cities of Attica under one government. Sesach, having carried on his victories to Mount Caucasus, leaves his nephew Prometheus there and Aetes in Colchis. In 967, Sesach, passing over the Hellespont, conquers Thrace, kills Lycurgus, king thereof, and gives his kingdom and one of his singing women to Oeagrus, the father of Orpheus. Sesach had in his army Ethiopians commanded by Pan and Libyan women commanded by Mirina or Minerva. It was the custom of the Ethiopians to dance when they were entering into a battle, and from their skipping they were painted with goats' feet in the form of satyrs. In 966 before Christ, Thoas, being made king of Cyprus by Sesach, goes thither with his wife Calicopis and leaves his daughter Hypsipyle in Lemnos. In 965 before Christ, Sesach is baffled by the Greeks and Scythians, loses many of his women with their queen Minerva, composes the war, and received by Amphion at a feast, buries Ariadne, goes back through Asia and Syria into Egypt with innumerable captives, among whom was Titonus, the son of Laomedon, king of Troy, and leaves his Libyan Amazons under Martisia and Lampeto, the successors of Minerva, at the river Thermodon. He left also in Colchos geographical tables of all his conquests, and thence geography had its rise. His singing women were celebrated in Thrace by the name of the Muses, and the daughters of Pierus, a Thracian, imitating them, were celebrated by the same name. In 964, Minos, making war upon Cocalus, king of Sicily, is slain by him. He was eminent for his dominion, his laws, and his justice. Upon his sepulchre, visited by Pythagoras, was this inscription: in Greek, Tou Dios, the sepulchre of Jupiter. Danaus, with his daughters, flying from his brother Egyptus, that is from Sesach, comes into Greece. Sesach, using the advice of his secretary Thoth, distributes Egypt into 36 nomes, and in every nome erects a temple and appoints the several gods, festivals, and religions of the several nomes. The temples were the sepulchres of his great men, where they were to be buried and worshipped after death, each in his own temple, with ceremonies and festivals appointed by him, while he and his queen, by the names of Osiris and Isis, were to be worshipped in all Egypt. These were the temples seen and described by Lucian 1100 years after, to be one and the same age. And this was the original of the several nomes of Egypt, and of the several gods and several religions of those nomes. Sesach divided also the land of Egypt by measure amongst his soldiers, and thence geometry had its rise, Hercules and Eurystheus born. In 963 before Christ, Amphision brings the 12 gods of Egypt into Greece, and these are the Dei Magni Majorum Gentium, to whom the earth and the planets and the elements are dedicated. In 962, Phrixus and Helle fly from their stepmother Ino, the daughter of Cadmus. Helle is drowned in the Hellespont, so named from her, but Phrixus arrived at Colchos. In 960, the war between the Lapitae and the people of Thessaly called Centaurs. In 958, Oedipus kills his father Laius. Sthenelus, the son of Perseus, resides in Mycene. In 956, Sesach is slain by his brother Iapetus, who after that was deified in Afrige by the name of Neptune and called Typhon by the Egyptians. Horus reigns and rules the Libyans, who under the conduct of Iapetus and his son Antaeus or Atlas invaded Egypt. Sesach, from his making the river Nile useful by cutting channels from it to all the cities of Egypt, was called by its names Sihor or Siris, Nilus and Egyptus. The Greeks, hearing the Egyptians lament Osiris and Bosiris, called him Osiris and Busiris. The Arabians, from his great acts, called him Bacchus, that is the Great. The Phrygians called him Maphors or Mavors, the Valiant, and by contraction Mars, because he set up pillars in all his conquests, and his army in his father's reign fought against the Africans with clubs. He is painted with pillars and a club. And this is the Hercules who, according to Cicero, was born upon the Nile, and according to Eudoxus, was slain by Typhon, and according to Diodorus, was an Egyptian, and went over a great part of the world, and set up the pillars in Afrige. He seems to be also the Belus, who, according to Diodorus, led a colony of Egyptians to Babylon, and there instituted priests called Chaldeans, who were free from taxes and observed the stars as in Egypt. Hitherto Judah and Israel labored under great vexations, but henceforward Asa, king of Judah, had peace 10 years. In 947 before Christ, the Ethiopians invade Egypt and drown Horus in the Nile. Thereupon, Bubaste, the sister of Horus, kills herself by falling from the top of an house, and their mother, Isis or Astrea, goes mad, and thus ended the reign of the gods of Egypt. In 946, Zerah, the Ethiopian, is overthrown by Asa. The people of the Lower Egypt make Osirsphus their king, and call in 200,000 Jews and Phoenicians against the Ethiopians. Menes or Amenophis, the young son of Zerah, and Sisya reigns. In 944, the Ethiopians under Amenophis retire from the Lower Egypt and fortify Memphis against Osirsphus, and by these wars and the Argonautic expedition, the great empire of Egypt breaks in pieces. Eurystheus, the son of Stheneleus, resides in Mycenae. In 943 before Christ, Evander and his mother Carmenta carry letters into Italy. In 942, Orpheus deifies the son of Semele by the name of Bacchus and appoints his ceremonies. In 940 before Christ, the great man of Greece, hearing the civil wars and destructions of Egypt, resolved to send an embassy to the nations upon the Euxine and Mediterranean seas, subject to that empire, and for that end ordered the building of the ship Argo. In 939 before Christ, the ship Argo is built after the pattern of the longship, in which Danaus came into Greece, and this was the first longship built by the Greeks. Chiron, who was born in the Golden Age, forms the constellations for the use of the Argonauts, and places the solstitial and equinoctial points in the 15th degrees or middles of the constellations of Cancer, Chalea, Capricorn, and Aries. Meton, in the year Nabonassar 316, observed the summer solstice in the 8th degree of Cancer, and therefore solstice had then gone back 7 degrees. It goes back 1 degree in about 72 years and 7 degrees in about 504 years. 504 years. Count these years back from the year of Nabonassar 316. Count these years back from the year of Nabonassar 316, and they will place the Argonautic expedition about 936 years before Christ. Gingris, the son of Thoas, slain and deified by the name of Adonis. 938 before Christ. Theseus, being 50 years old, steals Helena, then 7 years old. Pritos, the son of Ixion, endeavoring to steal Persephone, the daughter of Orcus, king of the Molossians, is slain by the dog of Orcus, and his companion Theseus is taken and imprisoned. Helena is set at liberty by her brothers. In 937 before Christ, the Argonautic expedition. Prometheus leaves Mount Caucasus, being set at liberty by Hercules. Laomedon, king of Troy, is slain by Hercules. Priam succeeds him. Talus, a brazen man of the brazen age, the son of Minos, is slain by the Argonauts. Aesculapius and Hercules were Argonauts, and Hippocrates was the 18th from Aesculapius by the father's side, and the 19th from Hercules by the mother's side, and because these generations, being noted in history, were most probably by the chief of the family, and for the most part by the eldest sons, we may reckon 28 or at the most 30 years to a generation. And thus the 17 intervals by the father's side and 18 by the mother's will at a middle reckoning amount unto about 507 years, which being counted backwards from the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, at which time Hippocrates began to flourish, will reach up to the time where we have placed the Argonautic expedition. (936 before Christ). Theseus is set at liberty by Hercules. 934 before Christ. The hunting of the Caledonian boar slain by Meleager. 930. Amenophis with an army out of Ethiopia and Thebais invades the Lower Egypt, conquers Ozarsiphus, and drives out the Jews and Canaanites. And this is reckoned the second expulsion of the shepherds. Callicopis dies and is deified by Thoas with temples at Paphos and Amathus in Cyprus and at Byblus in Syria, and with priests and sacred rites he becomes the Venus of the ancients and the Dea Cypria and Dea Syria. And from these and other places where temples were erected to her, she was also called Paphia, Amathusia, Biblia, Cytherea, Salaminia, Cnidia, Elicinia, Idalia, and etc. And her three waiting women became the three graces. In 928 before Christ, the war of the seven captains against Thebes. In 927 before Christ, Hercules and Aesculapius are deified. Eurystheus drives the Heraclides out of Peloponnesus. He is slain by Hyllus, the son of Hercules. Atreus, the son of Pelops, succeeds him in the kingdom of Mycenae. Menestheus, the great-grandson of Erechteus, reigns at Athens. 925. Theseus is slain, being cast down from a rock. In 924 before Christ, Hyllus, invading Peloponnesus, is slain by Ehemus. In 919, Atreus dies. Agamemnon reigns. In the absence of Menelaus, who went to look after what his father Atreus had left him, Paris steals Helena. 918 before Christ, the second war against Thebes. 912 before Christ, Thoas, king of Cyprus and part of Phoenicia, dies, and for making armor for the kings of Egypt is deified with a sumptuous temple at Memphis by the name of Baal Kenan, Vulcan. This temple was said to be built by Menes, the first king of Egypt, who reigned next after the gods, that is, by Menoph or Amenophis, who reigned next after the death of Osiris, Isis, Horus, Hubaste, and Thoth. The city, Memphis, was also said to be built by Menes. He began to build it when he fortified it against Ozarsiphus. And from him it was called Menoph, Moph, Noph, and etc. and is to this day called Menuf by the Arabians. And therefore Menes, who built the city and the temple, was Menoph or Amenophis. The priests of Egypt at length made this temple above 1,000 years older than Amenophis, and some of them 5 or 10,000 years older, but it could not be above 200 or 300 years older than the reign of Psammetichus, who finished it and died 614 years before Christ. When Menoph or Menes built the city, he built a bridge there over the Nile, a work too great to be older than the monarchy of Egypt. 909. Amenophis, called Memnon by the Greeks, built the Memnonia at Susa, whilst Egypt was under the government of Proteus, his viceroy. 904 904 Troy taken. Amenophis was still at Susa, the Greeks fearing that he came from thence to the Trojan War. 903 Demophon, the son of Theseus by Phoedra, the daughter of Minos, reigns at Athens. 901 Amenophis builds small pyramids in Kohome. 896 before Christ, Ulysses leaves Calypso in the island of Ogigi, perhaps Cadiz or Cales. She was the daughter of Atlas, according to Homer. The ancients at length feared that this island, which from Atlas they called Atlantis, had been as big as all Europe, Africa, and Asia, but was sunk into the sea. 895 before Christ. Teucer builds Salamis in Cyprus. Hadad or Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, dies, and is deified at Damascus with a temple and ceremonies. 887 before Christ. Amenophis dies and is succeeded by his son Ramesses or Ramstinitus, who builds the western portico of the temple of Vulcan. The Egyptians dedicated to Osiris, Isis, Horus Senior, Typhon, and Nephte, the sister and wife of Typhon. The 5 days added by the Egyptians to the 12 calendar months of the old lunisolar year, and said that they were added when these 5 princes were born. They were therefore added in the reign of Ammon, the father of these 5 princes. But this year was scarce brought into common use before the reign of Amenophis, for in his temple or sepulchre at Abydos they placed a circle of 365 cubits in compass, covered on the upper side with a plate of gold, and divided into 365 equal parts to represent all the days of the year, every part having the day of the year and the heliacal risings and settings of the stars on that day noted upon it. And this circle remained there till Cambyses spoiled the temples of Egypt. And from this monument I collect that it was Amenophis who established this year, fixing the beginning thereof to one of the 4 cardinal points of the heavens. For had not the beginning thereof been now fixed, the heliacal risings and settings of the stars could not have been noted upon the days thereof. The priests of Egypt, therefore, in the reign of Amenophis, continued to observe the heliacal risings and settings of the stars upon every day. And when by the sun's meridional altitudes they had found the solstices and equinoxes according to the sun's mean motion, his equation being not yet known, they fixed the beginning of this year to the vernal equinox, and in memory thereof erected this monument. Now, this year being carried into Chaldea, the Chaldeans began their year of Nabonassar on the same thought with the Egyptians and made it of the same length. And the thought of the first year of Nabonassar fell upon the 26th day of February, which was 33 days and 5 hours before the vernal equinox, according to the sun's mean motion. And the thought of this year moves backwards 33 days and 5 hours in 137 years, and therefore fell upon the vernal equinox 137 years before the era of the Nabonassar began, that is, 884 years before Christ. And if it began upon the day next after the vernal equinox, it might begin 3 or 4 years earlier, and there we may place the death of this king. The Greeks find that he was the son of Titonus, and therefore he was born after the return of Sesach into Egypt with Titonus and other captives, and so might be about 70 or 75 years old at his death. 883 before Christ. Dido builds Carthage, and the Phoenicians begin presently after to sail as far as to the strait's mouth and beyond. Aeneas was still alive according to Virgilius. 870 before Christ. Hesiod flourishes. He had told us himself that he lived in the age next after the wars of Thebes and Troy, and that this age should end when the man then living grew hoary and dropped into the grave, and therefore it was but of an ordinary length. And Herodotus has told us that Hesiod and Homer were 400 years older than himself. Whence it follows that the destruction of Troy was not older than we have represented it. 860 before Christ. Moeris resides in Egypt. He adorned Memphis and translated the seat of his empire thither from Thebes. There he built the famous labyrinth and the northern portico of the temple of Vulcan, and dug the great lake called the Lake of Moeris, and upon the bottom of it built 2 great pyramids of brick. And these things being not mentioned by Homer or Hesiod were unknown to them and done after their days. Moeris wrote also a book of geometry. 852 before Christ. Hazael, the successor of Hadad at Damascus, dies and is deified, as was Hadad before. And these gods, together with Arates, the wife of Hadad, were worshipped in their sepulchres or temples till the days of Josephus the Jew. And the Syrians boasted their antiquity, not knowing, said Josephus, that they were known. 844 before Christ. The Aeolic migration. Boeotia, formerly called Cadmeis, is seized by the Boeotians. 838 before Christ. Cheops resides in Egypt. He built the greatest pyramid for its sepulchre and forbade the worship of the former kings, intending to have been worshipped himself. In 825 before Christ, the Heraclides, after 3 generations, or 100 years, reckoned from their former expedition, returned into Peloponnesus. Henceforward, to the end of the first Messenian war, reigned 10 kings of Sparta by one race, and 9 by another, 10 of Messene, and 9 of Arcadia, which, by reckoning according to the ordinary course of nature, about 20 years to a reign, and one reign with another, will take up about 190 years. And the 7 reigns more in one of the 2 races of the kings of Sparta, and 8 in the other, to the battle at Thermopylae, may take up 150 years more, and so place the return of the Heraclides about 820 years before Christ. 824 before Christ. Khephren reigns in Egypt and builds another great pyramid. 808 Mykerinus reigns there and begins the third great pyramid. He shut up the body of his daughter in a hollow ox and caused her to be worshipped daily with odors. 804 before Christ. The war between the Athenians and Spartans, in which Codrus, king of the Athenians, is slain. 801 before Christ. Nitocris, the sister of Mykerinus, succeeds him and finishes the third great pyramid. 794 before Christ. The Ionic migration under the conduct of the sons of Codrus. 790 before Christ. Pul founds the Assyrian Empire. 788 before Christ. Asihis reigns in Egypt and builds the eastern portico of the temple of Vulcan very splendidly, and a large pyramid of brick made of mud, the god of the lake of Moeris. Egypt breaks into several kingdoms. Gnephagus and Bohoris reign successively in the Upper Egypt, Stephanatis, Nesepsos, and Nehus at Sais, Anisis or Amosis at Anisis or Hanes, and Tasellotis at Bubaste. 776 before Christ. Iphitus restores the Olympiads, and from this era the Olympiads are now reckoned. Gnephagus reigns at Memphis. 772. Nesepsos and Petosiris invent astrology in Egypt. 760. Semiramis begins to flourish. Sanchoniato writes. 751 before Christ. Sabakon, the Ethiopian, invades Egypt, now divided into various kingdoms, burns Bohoris, slays Nehus, and makes Anisis fly. 747 before Christ. Pul, king of Assyria, dies and is succeeded at Nineveh by Tiglath-Pileser and at Babylon by Nabonassar. The Egyptians who fled from Sabakon carry their astrology and astronomy to Babylon and found the era of Nabonassar in Egyptian years. 740 before Christ. Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, takes Damascus and captivates the Syrians. 729 before Christ. Tiglath-Pileser is succeeded by Salmanassar. 721 before Christ. Salmanaser, king of Assyria, carries the 10 tribes into captivity. 719 before Christ. Sennacherib reigns over Assyria. Archias, the son of Evagethus, of the stock of Hercules, leads a colony from Corinth into Sicily and builds Syracuse. 717 Tirhaka reigns in Ethiopia. 714 before Christ. Sennacherib is put to flight by the Ethiopians and Egyptians with great slaughter. 711 before Christ. The Medes revolt from the Assyrians, Sennacherib slain. Asarhaddon succeeds him. This is that Asarhaddon Pul or Sardanapalus, the son of Anasindaraxis or Sennacherib, who built Tarsus and Anchiale in one day. 710 before Christ. Lycurgus brings the poems of Homer out of Asia into Greece. 708 before Christ. Lycurgus becomes tutor to Charillus or Charilaus, the young king of Sparta. Aristotle makes Lycurgus as old as Iphitus because his name was upon the Olympic disc, but the disc was one of the 5 games called the Quinquertium, and the Quinquertium was first instituted upon the 18th Olympiad. Socrates and Thucydides made the institutions of Lycurgus about 300 years older than the end of the Peloponnesian War, that is, 705 years before Christ. 701. Sabakon, after a reign of 50 years, relinquishes Egypt to his son Sebekus or Seton, who becomes priest of Vulcan and neglects military affairs. 698 before Christ, Manasseh reigns. 697 before Christ, the Corinthians begin first of any man to build ships with 3 orders of oars called triremes. Hitherto, the Greeks had used long vessels of 50 oars. 687 before Christ, Tirhaka reigns in Egypt. 681 before Christ, Asarhaddon invades Babylon. 673 before Christ, the Jews conquered by Asarhaddon and Manasseh carried captive to Babylon. 671 before Christ, Asarhaddon invades Egypt. The government of Egypt committed to 12 princes. 668 before Christ, the western nations of Syria, Phoenicia and Egypt revolt from the Assyrians. Asarhaddon dies and is succeeded by Saos Lucianus. Manasseh returns from captivity. 658 before Christ, Phraaortes reigns in Medea. The Prytanes reign in Corinth, expelling their kings. 657 before Christ, the Corinthians overcame the Corcyraeans at sea, and this was the oldest sea fight. 655 before Christ, Psammetichus becomes king of all Egypt by conquering the other 11 kings with whom he had already reigned 15 years. He reigned about 39 years more. Henceforward, the Ionians had access into Egypt. And thence came the Ionian philosophy, astronomy, and geometry. 652 before Christ. The first Messenian War begins. It lasted 20 years. 647 before Christ. Charops, the first decennial archon of the Athenians. Some of these archons might die before the end of the 10 years, and the remainder of the 10 years be supplied by a new archon. And hence, the 7 decennial archons might not take up above 40 or 50 years. Saos Dushilus, the king of Assyria, dies and is succeeded by Siniladon. (640 before Christ). Josiah reigns in Judea. 636 before Christ. Phraates, king of the Medes, is slain in a war against the Assyrians. Astyages succeeds him. 635 before Christ. The Scythians invade the Medes and the Assyrians. 633 Battus built Cyrene, whereas Irasa, the city of Antaeus, had stood. 627 Rome is built. 625 before Christ. Nabopolassar revolts from the king of Assyria and reigns over Babylon. Phalantus leads the Parthians into Italy and builds Tarentum. 670 Psammetichus dies. Nekao reigns in Egypt. 611 Cyaxares reigns over the Medes. 610 before Christ. The princes of Scythians slain in a feast by Cyaxares. 609 before Christ. Josiah slain. Cyaxares and Nebuchadnezzar overthrow Nineveh, and by sharing the Assyrian Empire grow great. 607 before Christ. Creon, the first annual archon of the Athenians. The second Messenian War begins. Cyaxares makes the Scythians retire beyond Colchos and Iberia and seizes the Assyrian provinces of Armenia, Pontus, and Cappadocia. (606 before Christ). Nebuchadnezzar invades Syria and Judea. 604 before Christ. Nabopolassar dies and is succeeded by his son Nebuchadnezzar, who had already reigned 2 years with his father. 600 before Christ. Darius the Mede, the son of Cyaxares, is born. 599 before Christ. Cyrus is born of Mandane, the sister of Cyaxares and daughter of Astyages. 696 before Christ. Susiana and Elam conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. Caranus and Perdiccas fly from Pidon and found the kingdom of Macedon. Pidon introduces weights and measures and the coining of silver money. 590 before Christ. Cyaxares makes war upon Alyattes, king of Lydia. 588 before Christ. The temple of Solomon is burnt by Nebuchadnezzar. The Messenians, being conquered, fly into Sicily and build Messana. 585 before Christ. In the 6th year of the Lydian War, a total eclipse of the sun, predicted by Thales, May the 28th, puts an end to a battle between the Medes and the Lydians, whereupon they make peace and ratify it by a marriage between Darius Medus, the son of Cyaxares, and Ariane, the daughter of Alyattes. 584 before Christ. Phidon presides in the 49th Olympiads. 580 before Christ. Phidon is overthrown. Two men chosen by lot out of the city Elis to preside in the Olympic Games. 572 before Christ. Draco is archon of the Athenians and makes laws for them. 568 before Christ. The Amphictyons make war upon the Syrians by the advice of Solon and take Syrra. Clystenes, Alcmaeon, and Eurylochus commanded the forces of the Amphictyons and were contemporary to Phidon, for Leogides, the son of Phidon, and Megacles, the son of Alcmaeon, at one and the same time courted Agarista, the daughter of Clystenes. 569 before Christ. Nebuchadnezzar invades Egypt. Darius the Mede reigns. 562 Solon, being archon of the Athenians, makes laws for them. 557 before Christ. Periander dies and Corinth becomes free from tyrants. 555 before Christ. Nabonidus reigns at Babylon. His mother Nitocris adorns and fortifies that city. 550 before Christ. Pisistratus becomes a tyrant at Athens, the conference between Croesus and Solon. 549 before Christ. Solon dies. Hegestratus being archon of Athens. 544 before Christ. Sardes is taken by Cyrus. Darius the Mede recoins the Lydian money into darics. 538 before Christ. Babylon is taken by Cyrus. 536 before Christ. Cyrus overcomes Darius the Mede and translates the empire to the Persians. The Jews return from captivity and found the second temple. (529 before Christ). Cyrus dies. Cambyses reigns. 529 before Christ. Darius, the son of Hystaspes, reigns. The Magi are slain. The various religions of the several nations of Persia, which consisted in the worship of their ancient kings, are abolished, and by the influence of Hystaspes and Zoroaster, the worship of one god at altars without temples is set up in all Persia. 520 before Christ. The second temple is built at Jerusalem by the command of Darius. 515 before Christ. The second temple is finished and dedicated. 530 before Christ. Harmodius and Aristogiton slay Hipparchus, the son of Pisistratus, tyrant of the Athenians. 508 before Christ. The kings of the Romans expelled and consuls elected. 491 before Christ. The Battle of Marathon. 485 before Christ. Xerxes reigns. 480 before Christ. The passage of Xerxes over the Hellespont into Greece and battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. 464 before Christ. Artaxerxes Longimanus reigns. 457 before Christ. Ezra returns into Judea. Johanan, the father of Jaddua, was now grown up, having a chamber in the temple. 44 before Christ, Nehemiah returns into Judea, Herodotus writes. 431 before Christ, the Peloponnesian War begins. 428 before Christ, Nehemiah drives away Manasseh, the brother of Jaddua, because he had married Nicaso, the daughter of Sanballat. 424 before Christ, Darius Notus reigns. 422 before Christ, Sanballat builds a temple in Mount Gerizim and makes his son-in-law Manasseh the first high priest thereof. 412 before Christ, hitherto the priests and Levites were numbered and written in the chronicles of the Jews before the death of Nehemiah, at which time either Johanan or Jaddua was high priest, and here ends the sacred history of the Jews. 405 before Christ, Artaxerxes Mnemon reigns, the end of the Peloponnesian War. 359 before Christ, Artaxerxes Ocus reigns. 338 before Christ, Araugus reigns. 336 before Christ, Darius Kodamanus reigns. 332 before Christ, the Persian Empire conquered by Alexander the Great. 331 before Christ, Darius Kodamanus, the last king of Persia, slain. And with this date, the short chronicle ends, and the real body of the text starts, which gives a more detailed account of the events which took place, and also gives another very interesting information of concerning man's presence on earth. However, I do not yet want to speak about those interesting issues, because I want to end my today's speech, and perhaps I will do another separate recording about that issue.